Rural communities in developing countries are already experiencing some of the worst impacts of climate change and are often left to their own devices to cope and adapt to these changes. Well, our next team is leading a global effort to collect information about these countries to inform conservation and development activities to help people adapt to this changing climate. So in partnership with the World Wildlife Fund, please welcome Climate Crowd.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Snyder.
And I'm Nikhil Advani. So we're going to mix things up a bit and talk about mountain gorillas, at least initially. Has anybody here seen a mountain gorilla in the wild? I see a few hands. Where did you see them? Rwanda? Rwanda? DR Congo? I'm waiting for one other answer. Uganda, perfect. So there's only 880 mountain gorillas left in the wild in the entire world, and they're found in those 3 countries. A few years ago, we started getting reports that communities were entering the park to collect water. And it turns out that there were rivers that would flow year-round in the past, but due to changes in weather and climate, these rivers started to dry up during the dry season. Because of that, the communities would enter the park. When they do that, they would often set snares. The snares are targeted at animals like antelope for bushmeat. The problem is they'd often catch mountain gorillas, in particular the babies. And when a baby gets caught in a snare, it dies. So, as we've already said, there's 880 individuals. Losing even just one is a really big deal. So as an organization that's very focused on biodiversity, we quickly realized that, especially when you're thinking about climate change, we'd been looking at how climate change is impacting these species directly, but what about the communities that live around them? And as this example demonstrates, communities are being impacted by changes in weather and climate, and their coping mechanisms are often detrimental to biodiversity. And we realized we need to learn a lot more about this, and we need to implement solutions to help them adapt. So in this case, it's a really cool example. We built these rainwater harvesting tanks that you can see up there. They're done at a cost of about $1,000 to $2,000 each with community contribution, and it's resulted in a significant decline in park encroachment. So they accumulate water during the wet season, and during the dry season, it gets the households through it.
So the problems that Nikhil just talked about, they're happening in some of the most remote places on Earth. So the real question is, how do we actually collect this data, and at a scale that really matters? We launched Climate Crowd, an initiative that uses crowdsourcing to fill this critical information gap. To date, we have close to 1,000 reports that have been submitted online at www.climatecrowd.org. This is where we collect the data, we curate it, identify trends, and share it online so that conservation and development professionals can access it and use it to inform their own work. We engage with partners that work in these remote areas and have people on the ground that can help us to collect this data and implement WWF-funded solutions. These partners include university groups, international conservation NGOs, and a growing network of local NGOs as well. And we also work with the Peace Corps. Tom is a Peace Corps volunteer who has been working in Uganda for the past 2 years. After learning about Climate Crowd, he began talking to his local community and collecting data on how they were being impacted by a changing climate. The community expressed concern that with increasingly unpredictable rainfall, their communal water sources were being increasingly degraded. With prolonged drought, there wasn't enough water to go around. And when extreme storms would come, all of the runoff that they generated would contaminate the water and make people sick. And as Nikhil demonstrated, water access issues can also have consequences for biodiversity as well. So based on all these findings from his data collection, WWF provided funding so that Tom could work with his local community to develop a solution. Together, they transformed 4 open water sources into protected wells and springs that could better withstand the effects of climate change, thereby ensuring the community has access to a stable source of clean water. Now, this is just one of the projects we've implemented in the last year, but it really highlights how this data collection process can inspire solutions and can lead to on-the-ground projects that help people adapt.
So how do we take Climate Crowd to scale? The projects that we just talked about were the smaller projects. They cost about $2,000 each. We've also funded some bigger ones that are about $15,000 to $20,000. So we want to greatly scale this. We want to increase the number of partners we work with to both collect data and work with them to develop and implement on-the-ground solutions. And to do that, we're seeking $200,000 a year for the next 3 years. But we're also seeking help in this initiative. It's Climate Crowd. It's a crowdsourcing initiative. We want more and more people to get involved in it. So we're looking for help at how to increase information sharing amongst the community members themselves. At the moment, we're collecting the data, working with the people that are collecting the data, but the community members don't really have access to this kind of data. Is there a way that we can increase their access to it? We also want to be able to provide them with things like weather information to better help them plan their activities like farming. And lastly, data analysis. We have so much data coming in. We need to develop ways to analyze that data and to disseminate it to partners, organizations like WWF, like CARE, organizations that should be getting this information and integrating it into their activities. So I just want to wrap this up by saying that climate change is here. It's not a distant threat. It's not something that's going to happen for future generations. This is already here. Billions of people around the world are being impacted. But as you've seen today, we can develop some pretty cool solutions to help them at a fairly small cost. So with that in mind, we're asking you to join us on this journey and join the Climate Crowd.
Wonderful, thank you. So it's me again. Thank you for that. That was a great presentation, and I love the use of visuals to really tell the story very effectively, so well done. A couple questions for you. When you're talking about reaching scale with this work, I understand more projects and more data points, but what is the indicator, the measure of success for scale for you? Is it number of data points into the system? Is it number of projects able to be supported by the data you're receiving? What is the primary indicator of success for scale here?
Great question. I would suggest that those are actually more intermediate steps. The true success of this project is when other organizations, NGOs, but even beyond that, governmental organizations are actually taking this data and incorporating it into their work.
Great.
Because that is truly taking it to scale.
Sure.
So really influencing people who need to be influenced.
And to that end, that's a great response. To that end, how are you currently either making the data accessible to external parties beyond the partners that you mentioned in your presentation? Are you open sourcing it? How are we getting this out there so that it really can start to take off?
Yeah, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it's all openly available. Anybody can access this information. And we also produce country-level reports that kind of summarize the data that we're getting in and share it with our partners.
Cool. In terms of the data that comes in that then others will be using as this reaches scale, you mentioned that you're working with a variety of organizations on the ground, large organizations, small organizations. Every organization has a slightly different approach to measurement and evaluation and to data reporting. How are you looking at the verification, the validation of the data that you get in to make sure that what you're putting back out to potential users is actually valid, consistent, is kind of up to par with your expectations as an institution?
Yeah, so the nature of it is it's crowdsourced data. The reality is that we get a few reports that are somewhat from random people that we don't really know. The reality is that most of the partners we're working with, most of the people that are submitting data, are people that have had some element of training. The topics that we're exploring are somewhat complicated topics. Our data reporting form also has checkboxes for changes in weather and climate, so we have some sort of more quantitative aspects to it. But ultimately, we screen all the data. And as it's coming in, we screen it and then we post it. And we do realize, I've done a lot of these interviews myself, and you're in the communities and you start asking them what changes in weather and climate have you been experiencing. And I'll do like 20 interviews over 2 days. And sometimes you'll speak to people and one person says like, oh, it's getting really cold and there's a lot of frost. And other people are like, it's getting really hot and we can't take it. The idea with crowdsourcing the data is that as you build up really large amounts of data, trends will start to emerge. And what we also are doing are looking at observed weather data from those regions. We're also trying to install weather stations to collect more of that data as a way to corroborate our findings.
Appreciate that. And last quick question, as you scale the communities that you're seeking to serve and to collect information from, there are many considerations, obviously, around language, around bandwidth, around user interface technology. How are you approaching future iterations or growth of this in consideration of language and the kind of even device that someone might be using to report the data into the system?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the more future-looking things that I suggested there. It's something that I've sort of struggled with. How are we going to really make that leap? Because at the moment, we have the people that are collecting the data are people who have technology access. People who typically have English as a first language. Although that said, I've done this in Madagascar, and we had 3 different translations, like the local language to Malagasy to English for me. But typically, the people collecting the data have that training. They have the devices. I don't know what step it's going to take for the community members themselves to be submitting this data. My thought process was more to create some sort of an information sharing mechanism for them. I don't know that it would reach the point that they themselves were submitting it. But I think it really depends on the context, and where you're working. It could be very different from Africa to Asia to South America, for example.
A great pitch and very important work. Thank you so much.
Thanks.